Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. In today's episode, we explore the legacy of Costa Rica Afro Caribbean immigrants in the 1930s, a groundbreaking work by Dr. Natasha Gordon Chipembere. This conversation takes us deep into the history of Afro Caribbean migration, identity, and survival in Costa Rica during a period shaped by colonial structures, racial hierarchies, and cultural resilience. We'll discuss how Afro Caribbean immigrants navigated discrimination while building vibrant communities, preserving cultural heritage, and leaving a lasting imprint on Costa Rica's history. Through Dr. Gordon Chipembere's insights, we reflect on themes of migration, belonging, and the enduring connections between the Caribbean and Central America. So, settle in and join us for this powerful and enlightening dialogue that shines light on a history too often overlooked, yet central to our understanding of the Caribbean diaspora.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Natasha Gordon Chipembere, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, to discuss your article that I happened to see, Legacy of Costa Rica, African Caribbean Immigrants of the 1930s. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on this platform. I am really excited about having this conversation. I was born in Brooklyn many moons ago to a Costa Rican mother and a Panamanian father who still remain in Brooklyn. And I have traveled the world, but I currently live with my husband and my children they're adults, they're young adults now, in Costa Rica, and I've been here for 11 years. So this is my maternal homeland. And so 11 years ago, we decided as a family unit to return. And I have a very large network of cousins and aunts and uncles here. But I also am a professor of literature. I've been in the classroom for almost 30 years now, and I teach writing and African diasporic literature. I have taught in classrooms from South Africa to New York to obviously in Costa Rica now. I'm a professor here at a US-based university. And in 2002, so almost 3 years ago, I completed and published through Jaded Ibis Press my first book in a trilogy on Afro-Costa Ricans called Finding La Negrita, which is a historical Africanist rewriting of the Black Madonna story in Costa Rica.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I'll make sure that that is in the show notes as well. So people want to explore more, they can be able to, navigate that link. So, would you be able to share, what personally drew you to explore the history of Afro-Caribbean immigrants in Costa Rica, particularly from Jamaica?
Yes. So in coming to Costa Rica, I've come to Costa Rica my entire life, to see my grandmother and to have family reunions. I had my quinceañera here, my sweet 15. And so there was always a relationship in terms of coming to see the family, right? All the cousins and essentially our Black family. Even though as I came to Costa Rica and sort of was in the capital, which is San Jose, I was very much aware that my family was a Black family, and there were other Black families that we socialized with, but essentially it was not a Black space, right? And I remember like even walking in San Jose once and somebody shouting out of a car, Negra, Morena, and feeling really insulted and feeling like, oh, I don't belong in this place. That's a radically different story now.
Mhm.
But I very much felt like in the enclave of my family, we were very much, Afro Caribbean people, particularly amongst the elders, right? Where you could sit down and,
Yes.
hear a good story, a duppy tale or whatever everybody's going to tell you about. But these were memories that folks had from being on the Caribbean coast, which is Puerto Limon, which is where my family originally came in from, in terms of the Caribbean. So I always wondered, in thinking about my writing and thinking about coming to Costa Rica and thinking about raising my Black children here. My husband is Malawian American. We met in South Africa almost 30 years ago. And so we've traveled extensively, and we had a very large sort of diasporic community in Brooklyn. But thinking about safety and place for our children was really one of the, I would say, the main motivators for moving to Costa Rica, but also thinking about, well, in terms of belonging, where is this
Yeah.
history? So as a writer, as a scholar, as a professor, someone who specifically does work around slavery, one of the things that I was very interested in my writing was my own family lineage, right? And that's actually, since I'm doing a trilogy of historical
Yes.
fiction, the third book, which is called Naomi, will actually be a loose rewriting of my great-grandmother Ruth's life in coming from Jamaica and setting up a life in Puerto Limon. But as I came to Costa Rica and started talking to the family, because it wasn't just like, you only eating come for just 10 days and a family reunion and Christmas lunch, but I was here. I had a home. My children went to school. There was work and everyday activities. And so you started going to the soccer game of cousins, and you started going to birthday parties and other things and visiting relatives. And these are the conversations that started to come up, particularly amongst the elders. Tell me your stories, tell me your stories. And between one cousin and I, we have really done a fantastic job of kind of tracing the genealogy of our family. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I guess going into that, what has your own family history revealed to you about, of course, migration, identity, and of course, belonging in Costa Rican context?
Well, it's really interesting because Costa Rica has historically presented itself as sort of the Switzerland of Central America, that it's this homogenous, sort of mestizo, non-Black, which is really interesting, country that's peaceful, right? And has all these environmental commitments, which it does. It's incredible. It's a population of 5 million people, right? And we
Hmm.
have some of the, like 5% of the world's flora and fauna. It is an incredible country. There's so many different things to do, but one of the things that Costa Rica has yet to sort of work inside of, and it's doing better. It's doing
Hmm.
better because I've been here 11 years. I've seen progression. Is really think about the presence, the legacy, the contributions of Afro-Costa Ricans. So if you're in San Jose and you speak to someone, oh, where are the Black people, right?
Yeah.
What they will say is, or at least where are the Afro-Costa Ricans? They'll say, oh, they're on the Caribbean coast in Limon,
Yes. Yeah.
right? And in actuality, that's not necessarily the truth, because statistically today, there are more Afro-Costa Ricans of Afro-Caribbean descent in San Jose and the surrounding area than there are in Puerto Limon today, right?
Mhm.
And so what you do find is the elders will stay in their home. So the grandparents will stay in Limon because they're not interested in coming to San Jose. But the young people come up for university, for work, they marry, and they spread out. So since I was born in New York, you could always say, okay, in Flatbush, that's a Caribbean
Yes.
area, Harlem used to be very African, you could go up there and get everything you need. I mean, obviously that's not the truth now with gentrification. We
Yeah.
understand that. But in growing up in New York, those are sort of the spaces. So in San Jose, there is no designated spot where it's like, oh, the Black folks live over there.
Yes.
Usually what happens is because the numbers are so small,
Hmm.
what you have are Afro Costa Ricans who will usually come up for university, and then they will marry, usually maybe not even someone who is Afro Costa Rican, or they will marry someone who is a mestizo, and that's the narrative of my family, right? So
Yes.
we had folks who came from Limon, they got educated, doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, the whole, shebang. But in that process, there are about 10 or 11 main families from Limon, and everybody kind of knows each other. Some folks married to each other, but many people just diversified. So it was really like, you ended up dating the person who was in your university class, right? Or someone you met at work, and that's kind of how things spread out. So I would say you have right now in San Jose, to say there are lots of Black couples. There are, but I would say they're older, like parents,
Yes.
and then their children, as in the experience of my family, have married out of being, Afro Costa Rican. And in many cases, they're marrying out because race doesn't figure in
Mm-hmm.
as much as class does, right? So
Yes.
class and access to resources, what private school you went to, what religious
Mm-hmm.
school you went to, what church you go to, all of those things are more determining sort of social factors and how people will partner and then produce family, more so than, let's say, just because you're a Black person, I'm going to necessarily partner with you, right? Um, and so for me, in terms of my own family, one of the things that I was really excited about finding out is essentially how we got here, right? And so in thinking about Costa Rica gained its independence. I mean, this whole region did except Panama, in 1821, right? And
Yes.
slavery, which Costa Rica had over 200 years of slavery, ended in 1824. So it was sort of a Juneteenth situation where folks didn't
Mm-hmm.
get the memo until 3 years later. Even though there was a free Black and mestizo community or mulatto community that existed as well, right? Which is kind of what I talk about in my novel. Because very few people, it's not a maroon community. This is a community that lived alongside of enslaved Africans at the time period. But um, from most people will say, okay, well, Costa Rica gained its independence in 1821. So how did it establish itself as sort of part of an economic market in the region? What ends up happening is that essentially the Costa Rican government decides that their main crop, which is coffee, which is harvested in the highlands, not in the
Mm-hmm.
tropical region, not in the beach, has to be they have to find a better way to get it to their main market, which is Europe and the United States, right? And so what historically Costa Ricans had been doing was they had been taking the coffee and taking it on ships from the Pacific and sailing all the way down South America and coming all the way up through the Atlantic and
Mm-hmm.
trying to get to the US and the UK. But obviously the coffee would spoil at that point, and so it was their detriment. So they were very clear on, we need a railroad. We need something that will take us directly from the Central Highlands, San Jose, right? Cartago, that region, and then bring it right to the Atlantic coast, right? Bring it right into the backyard of the Caribbean, the United States, and then ultimately into the UK. And so Costa Rica tried to, create their own workers, did not work. They brought in even prisoners from New Orleans. They imported Chinese laborers. It did not work. And so ultimately at that time period, we're talking right at the turn of the 20th century. Um, at that time period, the major railroad builder was a white American named Henry Meigs, right? And he had been building railroads throughout the region for a long time. And so he was initially contracted by the Costa Rican government when they couldn't produce it themselves. But he originally took on the contract, but then gave it over to his nephew, Minor Cooper Keith, right? And that's an important name. He's from Brooklyn, white American, and ultimately Minor Cooper Keith is one of the founders of the United Fruit Company, right? And so the Banana Republic, I mean, all of these things. But initially, Minor Cooper Keith made a 99-year agreement called the Soto-Keith agreement with the Costa Rican government to basically build a railroad. And he was exempt from tax. And essentially what they did was he owned the land along the railroad tracks, right? And so Minor Cooper Keith from Brooklyn, he did not speak Spanish. He was not a Catholic, right? And so those are the main issues of Costa Rica, right? And so what did he do? He looked for a labor force that, one, would speak English, two, was not Catholic, three, that he could contract very easily for X amount of years and then have them return, right, to wherever they were coming from. But also he wanted to make sure that they didn't have any particular loyalties to, let's say, the Costa Rican government, right? And so what did he do? He went to Jamaica, right? He went to Bahamas. He went to Bermuda. He went to these Anglophone former British colonies where he contracted laborers, Black Caribbean laborers, mostly men, but some women, to come and work on the railroad. Yes. And then what ends up happening is, so the first ship comes in the Lizzie, and it's 123 workers, and it is in 1877 was the first ship that comes to work on the Northern Railroad line. That's what it was called. It was called the Northern, right? And that's really important because that's the story of how my people get here, right? So 1877, Lizzie shows up, and then what ends up happening is the Northern Railroad Company that is managed by Minor Cooper Keith and the Northern Company, they end up creating sort of like a hotel or a barracks, or it's a segregated space, right? Where only white Americans who are coming in on the Atlantic on ships who want a place to stay overnight, or let's say folks who are coming in from San Jose who are riding the train, right? Who business people, they needed a place to stay. And so what ends up happening is my great grandfather, William Grusong, worked in a hotel in New Orleans, and he was contracted by Minor Cooper Keith's company to come to Costa Rica to run the Northern, and that's what it was called. It was called the Quarters, the Northern Hotel. But he was a Black man, right? And he was contracted to do that. So William, my great grandfather, ends up going to Jamaica and meeting my grandmother. And then in 1908, my great-grandmother Ruth, they marry. And in 1908, they land in Costa Rica, right, in Puerto Limon. And we have the stamps of passports and everything that show, date of entry in 1908. And essentially that begins our story here in Costa Rica. And they end up having 7 children. And then those children have children. But my grandmother, my mother, et cetera. And that's essentially how they get here. And what's really interesting is that my great grandfather, he dies pretty quickly, like in the process, probably within 10 years of coming to Limon. And my great grandmother Ruth and her children end up essentially running the Northern as Black women. Yeah. Right? The only Black women in those spaces, right? Except, and whoever they'd contracted to hire to do the laundry and the cooking, et cetera. But they had private rooms in the back, right? For my great grandmother Ruth. And essentially as a widow, she was able to run this hotel space with all these white men, for over 25 years, until they actually closed the space. So they were the sole proprietors. They were the sole managers of this hotel space, which is a really interesting narrative because most of the time what you hear is, folks came from Jamaica, they were in the barracks, they either worked on the railroad. After the railroad was finished, obviously Minor Cooper Keith couldn't pay folks to go back to Jamaica. So what did they do? He gave them land. And that's how the bananas started. People started growing banana because it was so ripe. The land was so fertile. And that's how you begin to have multiple generations of folks, because once they're committed to the land, then they start having families. And then you have multiple generations, and you don't necessarily have the same nostalgia of wanting to go home.
Exactly. You have a connection. You're planted pretty much.
Exactly.
And then I guess, what were then, of course, now the conditions, in the 1930s, that really shaped the Afro-Caribbean community's experience in Costa Rica?
Right. So it was really clear in the legislation, in the literature, in the social policies, that these Afro-Caribbean people were essentially migrants. They were temporarily in these spaces, even though you're talking about multiple generations at this
Yes.
point, right? 50, 60, 70 years of folks. But essentially what happened was Limon became its own Black enclave, right? And it faced out to the Atlantic world. So it faced the Caribbean, it faced the United States. Ships came in all the time. My mother would tell me, they would get the records that would come. Sailors would bring, the records and the Marcus Garvey's newspapers and all of these sort of exciting things that was happening in the Black world was happening at a daily pace, right? And so it was very engaging that way. People also traveled. That we were talking about migrations, but it wasn't only a migration to Costa Rica, right, to Limon to work and then kind of be planted, but people returned home and then they came back. My great grandmother was known to be like, when she needed to take a vacation, she had a very famous black fur coat that she would go and she would get on a ship and she would go to New York to visit friends. And so she was cosmopolitan in that way, right? I mean, she had wealth, she had her own home, she built home for all 7 of her children. And so in Limon, there was an area called Jamaica Town, right? And in Limon, called Barrio Roosevelt today, but it's called Jamaica Town. And I think they're trying to get it back to its original name.
Yes.
But this is essentially where Jamaicans lived. And not only did they live, they thrived, right? So you had a Marcus Garvey kind of presence there because Marcus Garvey left Jamaica and came and was probably one of the organizers to unionize the workers for the United Fruit Company. Once the Northern closed and Minor Cooper Keith joined multiple companies together to produce and export bananas. And at one point, Costa Rica was the world's exporter of bananas, the largest exporters of bananas. Yes, mid 20th century, they were sending all those bananas out. Today, we obviously know that the United Fruit Company doesn't exist, but its children do. So
Yes.
Dole and Chiquita and all of these like subsequent little companies, they are still part of the parent company, which was the United Fruit Company that ran the entire coast, right? So it wasn't just Costa Rica, you're talking about Nicaragua and going all the way up and down the coast in terms of bananas. And then obviously in the South Panama, you had the Panama Canal being built. And there was a lot of movement as well, where cousins,
Yes.
one cousin came to Costa Rica to work on the bananas, another cousin went to Panama to work. And so there was a lot of intermixing. And therefore, I have a Panamanian father and a Costa Rican mother because there was a lot of interchange and people didn't have any issues with that kind of movement.
Yes.
But yes, I would say that the 1930s world of my great grandparents in Limon was very much kind of a replica of a Jamaican parish, very much the Baptist church was the center of all activity. And then one of the interesting things is that the community got together and they paid to have teachers from Jamaica come and live in Limon and teach their children. Right. And so you had this entire process you had English school. That's what the kids knew. And then they went to church, they went to Sunday school. So there was a whole rhythm. There was lots of newspaper articles because that's how people communicated, right? And then there was the social aspect as well, right? Where you'd go to the park on Sundays. Everybody knows that on Sunday afternoon after church, there's going to be a big lunch, right? That there's going to be probably some stewed chicken, some rice and peas, some, plantain salad. I mean, the typical Caribbean fare that even today in Limon, the country boasts of, Costa Rica will say, oh, the food of limon. The food of limon is very much Jamaican food. There's no, because a lot of the same vegetables and herbs and, Scotch bonnet and all of those things that use, and coconut, that are basic part of the food in Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean were just replicated in Limon because the climate is the same, right? So it's Caribbean in the sense of it's very humid, and there's rain and there's lots of sun. Junto,
Exactly.
right? Right. And so I would say that their world was very much regulated on the understanding and the respectability politics of the church. Were there people who practiced other religions? Yes, Pocomania. There was, other smaller, there was maybe some Catholics, but I would say that mostly were Baptist Protestants. But church was very central, at least in my family. It regulated all ways of life, whether that means the women's group meetings or, Sunday service, or there was going to be a prayer meeting, and all of those things were very much structured as part of folks, of their everyday life. And I think a lot of those ideas around respectability, around partnerships, around knowing families, around food and nutrition and healing and care and midwifery, because I know that my grandmother had her children with a midwife, right? It wasn't like you were running to a hospital. And it's interesting because I chose to have my two children in New York with a midwife, right? Not in a hospital. So maybe I was pulling on some of those ancient ideas around knowing and a woman's body and intuition and everything else.
No, definitely. Those are the practices that were done and continued. And people wanted to make sure that just shows another level of connectedness. And you did allude to this, but I mean, how did, labor and of course, U.S. corporate interests, especially in the banana industry, affect the migration of Jamaicans to the Atlantic coast?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can look at Garvey as a really good example, right? So he shows up in, the 1917, I think is when he first shows up in Costa Rica, and he's astounded at how poorly the living conditions are for Jamaicans and other Afro Caribbeans who are working for the United Fruit Company and who are, growing bananas. He's astounded, the conditions are slavery-like, right? And it's interesting because a lot of the workers were not being paid, they weren't being paid currency. They were paid through the commissary. And so there was and my mother explained this to me because my uncle was one of the people who would manage the money and the accounting. And so the commissary was sort of a space, kind of like an American warehouse of like goods. So if you needed a pair of shoes for your kids, if you needed school uniforms, if you needed, toothpaste, if you needed just even basics, or you needed rice and sugar or whatever, you could take your slip of whatever your wage was, and you would then turn it in for goods. So you were never actually with physical currency ever. And that, so you get trapped in this cycle of, okay, we have these goods, but we don't actually have other forms of liquid wealth, right? In terms of being able to say, well, let me save some money. Let me go into San Jose. Let me build a house. Let me not work on the bananas. It was this constant cycle of sort of dependency and poverty and exploitation that we very clearly defined the life of I would say Afro Caribbean people. And then what ends up happening is this. In 1948, there's a civil war in Costa Rica, and the president decides, well, we have all of these Afro-Costa Ricans, well, Afro-Caribbean people, these Black people that are, that are in the Caribbean. We now, I mean, the numbers are not so significant, but it's a whole community, right? And we have multiple generations living now. So what are we to do with them? And so it's in 1948 that he decides, no, we're going to, even if you were born in Costa Rica and you're Black, but of Afro Caribbean legacy, you're going to be made into a citizen if you choose, and you have to become naturalized, right? And so there's this family, Alex Corling, who's the first Black lawyer in Costa Rica, begins with his daughter, who's also a lawyer. They begin literally going house by house, helping families fill out the naturalization papers so they can become citizens in Costa Rica. So my mother, for example, born, I think, in 1938, 1939, her mother was born in Costa Rica, right? Her father was born in Jamaica. And, you know, they make a family decision that in 1948, they're going to naturalize. So my mother, her three sisters, and my grandmother, so two generations of Costa Rican born already, still, but they have been stateless, right? So my grandmother, even though she's born in Costa Rica, she was stateless essentially, right? And my mother was stateless, didn't have an identity, but kind of took the nationality of her father, who's Jamaican. And it was only my grandfather, Stephen Rowbottom, who decides, no, I'm not becoming a Costa Rican. I'm going to stay a Jamaican until I die. And so he does not naturalize. And it's interesting because when he dies, in the early 1970s, there is sort of a foreigner cemetery here in San Jose, and that's where he's buried. He's not buried with other Costa Ricans, right? So there's a whole space, a whole cemetery just for foreigners, for non-nationals. But yeah, I mean, it's incredible, right? The way segregation works, all of that. But yes, after 1948, you essentially have the absorption of all of these Afro-Caribbean people who then make the transition into becoming Afro-Costa Ricans, right? But their prices, obviously.
Yeah.
The first price, of course, is that the Costa Rican government says, okay, you got to give up your English schools. You have to learn Spanish because in Limon, you had Limonense Creole and you had English, standard English. I mean, people weren't speaking Spanish because they weren't really coming up to San Jose. There wasn't a university campus in Limon. And so pretty much you finished high school and then you made a choice. You either worked in Limon, you came to San Jose to go to university, or you left the country, right? And those are the three options if you wanted to do more study. And so my mother and my grandparents eventually moved to San Jose so that all of their children could get educated at the University of Costa Rica, right? And that was a choice they made. And then the rest of the family followed. So all the cousins, everybody. I do not personally have any family members living in Limon today.
Okay.
Right? Everybody got, and there was a very big earthquake in the 1990s in Limon, and there was one family house that everybody kind of used if you wanted to, you know, kind of vacation and go to Limon and go to the beach or whatever. People just kind of used it interchangeably, and the house was destroyed during that earthquake. So that was the last family property that was kept at that time period.
Amazing. I mean, just what you're saying is just amazing. And it kind of leads to the next two questions. One is, again, I know that you mentioned before, you touched on it in terms of with language and of course, with cultural practices. So how did it, Afro-Caribbean immigrants maintain, of course, their language, their religious practice, and of course, their cultural identity in face of the systemic pressure to assimilate in Costa Rica?
Yeah. I think, very much the language. So Dr. Marva Spence Sharp is the #1 Afro-Costa Rican linguist on Limonense Creole in the country. And she is a scholar with incredible expertise and has done incredible work in documenting the language and teaching about the language, but also really encouraging younger people today to be able to speak it, to the Limonense Creole, which, I mean, some people say, oh, it's a dialect, it's patois, it's broken English. No, it actually is a full language that very much established itself with Spanish words and English words and African bases. And so there are very specific language patterns that I think people very much still utilize, when they need to, particularly if they want to speak about something privately, right? And all of a
Yes.
sudden, not everybody needs to hear.
Yes.
Um, and I also think language. I mean, beyond language, I think also food, right? So I
Yes.
think that that's incredibly important. The way that those still rituals around Sunday dinner,
Mm-hmm.
right? And making sure that you're eating properly and that the food is well seasoned and people really do a lot of things from scratch. And there are, there's that ritual of coming together and everybody sits down and eats on Sunday.
Yes.
But I also think religion, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so beyond music, we have that, but I think that religion, particularly the Baptist Church and the Anglican Church too, are two spaces where folks felt a safety and a power and an identity. And I think that, obviously we're looking at very patriarchal Caribbean societies where men had, a lot more say and power than women did. But in actuality, when we really look at who had the power, in many cases, it was the women who were
Yes.
running things, right,
Yes.
behind closed doors. And I think that in the church space, at least I see that in evidence in with my great grandmother Ruth and my grandmother Leonora, and even my mother in New York today, the way that they're committed to their churches, the way that they head their women groups, the way that they provide care and prayer and thoughtfulness, and they apply that through the community, and then are very, very much respected in the communities in which they're part of. Yeah, there's evidence of that, and I think that people take those like religious identities very seriously.
Yes.
Um, so seriously to the point, and I'll say that now probably with the elders in my family. So I would say my elder cousins are probably in their late 70s, early 80s. Um, and I would say that their faith is so powerful. However, it doesn't necessarily line up with the changes of our contemporary generation. So it sometimes their religious belief is not as inclusive of
Mm-hmm.
various
Yes.
communities and peoples and belief systems that need to be included, particularly when there's hardship. And so
Yes.
I would say that in a very gentle way, because that wasn't the way that I understood things, or the way that I sort of understood faith. My understanding of faith is a lot more inclusive, and I think a lot more Baha'i. I'm not Baha'i,
Yes.
but a lot more welcoming, or even like
Mm-hmm.
Quaker like.
Yes.
And my children were raised more they went to Quaker school and were raised in more of that sensibility in terms of activism, in terms of political consciousness and commitment, and also understanding that they have to participate and have a voice, and not just understand that prayer is important, but they also
Mm-hmm.
have to participate in also justice, right? And so that's really so a much more political, I think, entry or relationship with spirituality and religion, at least in my generation, and my children's.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then this is the second part to that, which is again, would you be able to discuss again the significance of English and patois as cultural markers during that period as well?
Yes. So everybody spoke standard English, like that was something that, particularly from Jamaica, because that was very much well respected. You had English teachers from Jamaica, and my mother would always tell me, the English teachers, and if she made a mistake, she'd have to stand at the board, and the teacher would just hit her hand with the ruler. And I mean, it was very much, there was corporal punishment, there were all these things, but you understood that the teacher was the most important and respected person in that community, and your parents were paying that person. These were not free schools, right? And so I think what ended up happening is, like in my mother's generation, they went to Spanish school in the morning and then continued English school at night. So they went to school twice, right? Which when we think about it, like other religious
Yes.
groups, I think about like even the Hasidics, I think
Mm-hmm.
of other communities where they have, or different levels of school and participation and education, right? And I think that that's something that was mirrored in that time in order to fortify their identity. They understood that they had to assimilate, right? So my grandmother, until she came to San Jose when she was in her 50s, she didn't speak Spanish. She didn't have to because everybody spoke English, right? In Limon. My grandfather never learned any Spanish. His job didn't require it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But my mother is a retired Spanish professor because she went to school, the UCR, and actually learned Spanish, became fluent in it, and then essentially taught her mother so that she could navigate the community once she came to San Jose and left Limon, and her relatives. So it's interesting because I think now, people ask all the time, do you understand Limonense Creole? Do you speak it? I am like, I understand it perfectly. I don't
Yes.
speak it. It wasn't something, in growing up in Brooklyn, it wasn't something that my mother spoke. But when I was with my relatives and everybody was
Mm-hmm.
like together, I
Yeah.
could understand it, right? And so that was not a problem. So I can be in any space and understand, oh, trouble's coming because I could hear it, right? But there's such a desire for it now. I hear it
Yes.
even like amongst mestizos, because who are like, oh, your family's from Limon. Do you know how to speak Limonense Creole? Like it's a badge of culture.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but in sometimes in my family now, they'll speak it, but for the most part, my family just speaks Spanish, right? And only the elders are the ones who will speak some English and write some English. But for the most part, everybody just speaks Spanish now.
Yeah. Which is interesting, which is very interesting to see that whole change happening as well. And you've written about state imposed racism and segregation. What forms did anti-blackness take in the 1930s Costa Rica?
In terms of immigration?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess the most blatant, the most apparent was the railroad. So the Northern Railroad that went from Puerto Limon, that went all the way up into the Central Valley, into San Jose, and even parts of Cartago, there was an understanding that you Black people who were coming from Limon could only stay in San Jose and had to return, right? So there was almost a sense of a curfew, right? You
Mm-hmm.
had to get back on the train and return. So you could go for the day, you could do shopping or whatever, but you had to come back. There was also an understanding that by Guapiles is probably about an hour and 45 minutes from Puerto Limon going up into San Jose. By Guapiles, that was essentially the marker where Black people knew, okay, this is the last stop. I'm
Yeah.
not going to go into San Jose. So I had to get off and do whatever I needed to do and then get back on the train and go back to Limon. So I would say the general sentiment was that Blacks were not welcome in
Mm-hmm.
San Jose. There were few and far between. The racism was very intense. Also, what ended up happening was Minor Cooper Keith, decided that he wanted to extend the United Fruit Company to the Pacific coast. And so what ends up happening is he makes an agreement with the Costa Rican government to, take over some land on the Pacific. But the Costa Rican government says, okay, you can extend, you can go, and we will have an agreement with you for bananas. But two things need to happen. One, you're only hiring mestizos that live in the Pacific region. And two, you're not allowed to bring any Blacks with you whatsoever into the Pacific. Right. And so he does. And so that's what ends up happening. And he takes the United Fruit Company, moves to the Pacific, fails,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's disease on the bananas, but then he abandons the community. And the United Fruit Company was the sole employer for like 90% of the community in Puerto Limon. And so people had to basically figure out on their own. And, people are very obviously ingenious and they're creative. And so they make a way, right? But even if you go to Puerto Limon today, the city is not built up. You
Yeah.
will notice, the old houses are there. People feel like they have been left out of government representation. It's slowly happening over time. I would say that in, what is it, 2015, with the election of President Guillermo Solis, he was the first president, and we were here for that, where he understood himself as an Afro-Costa Rican, even though visually he looked like a mestizo. His mother and aunt were from Jamaica, right? And so they were Afro-Caribbean people who came from Limon. So he recognized that history, and he set up, for the first time in Costa Rica's history, a Ministry of Afro-Costa Rican Affairs. Right. And the Afro-Costa Rican writer Kins Duncan was the minister of that office, but he was only in office for one term. And once that term finished, everything closed down. But during that time period, you had a lot more interest in Limon, where there was money being put towards Limon for just building up the area, more resources for young people. There was the establishment of the University of Costa Rica, a campus in Limon. And so all of these things started to happen. And then people started taking more pride, and now August is huge here in Costa Rica. So August is Black History Month, right? Usually on the 31st of August, there's a huge parade, but it's a cultural parade in Limon. But now in San Jose, all through the month, there are different events and films and fashion shows and parades, and it's incredible. And it's the first time I've actually seen where there are parades in other areas as well, in Cartago and Turrialba. And I'm like, wow, that's incredible, right? And many of the people who are in the parades, who are dancing, who are wearing African type garb, are mestizos. They're not Afro-Costa Ricans, but they have been trained, right? They're in their dance performance and everything else, as this is part of celebrating all of Costa Rica's multicultural identity.
That is just amazing. That is absolutely just amazing, just to know that that takes place, and then of course this whole cultural identity being preserved and carried forth. So I know you spoke to it a little bit before, but would you be able to speak to, I guess, to any other experiences of Afro-Caribbean women during this time, whether as workers, mothers, or of course cultural bearers?
Right. My understanding from what my mother told me was that, my great-grandmother Ruth, as this hotel, proprietor and a property owner, and someone who kept her money stuffed under the bed and sewn into like coats and pockets, and because she didn't trust banks, but had a lawyer who was very clear on what she wanted for her children and her family. She was not an anomaly. She was not a rarity, right? There were women who were running businesses, who were, heading church missions and educating children. And what was also a practice, that is still a practice I see, at least in my family, for the women who were not partnered, who did not end up having children, they ended up sponsoring other children in their families, right? And so that means putting them all the way through school, graduate school, whatever, setting them up with a career, helping them establish a home, whatever it was. And I think that those particular patterns of womanhood are very much replicated still today. I have cousins who have done that, from kindergarten all the way through law school for cousins. And that particular part of taking care of other family members, because one thing that was very clear, and I think it's still very clear in Limon today, education is important, right? And we know this. I mean, we know how Black women are educated. I mean, think about the United States. Black women are the most educated population and continue to be growing. I think that once you have education, every door opens. There's nothing that you can't do, right? But it was still a very patriarchal society. And so women were still socialized to partner, get married, have children. It was a heterosexual society, where those expectations were there. And obviously your role in the church as an elder particularly was something very important. I think women also were involved with nursing and medical care. And I think that was really important. So you have a lot of people in families who may not be doctors, but they were nurses, but they also knew the traditional ways of healing. And that is something that, very quick, if I tell my mother, she's like, okay, go and find a bush, the bush tea, you're going to have some Cersei, you're going to have all of those things were instinctual. And, 4 generations later, I still understand that. Like if my daughter is like, oh, I don't feel, I'm like, okay, so we're gonna get some soursop, we're gonna get some, and make get some leaves and we're gonna make a tea and all of these things. And those are the options first, right? Having good food, having water, hydrating, making sure that you use the natural remedies around you, right? And I think a lot of these women were also visionaries in the sense that they would, they also interpreted dreams. They would tell you what, what to look out for. If you dreamt fish, somebody was pregnant, and it was very quick, that line was very quick. So even though I lived in New York, there was a hot line, put it that way, with the relatives and the aunties. And so if somebody had a dream, by mid-afternoon, it had been interpreted 6 ways, and somebody had called from Costa Rica and, you needed to do this and this and this. But I also think that there were communities of care that were, automatically there, whether that meant for a death, that meant, the men were, many of the men were Freemasons in this community, and they understood, what they had to do to provide support for a family that maybe had lost someone, right? And all of those things were taken care of within the community. Right. So I think that, and women understood that, and women maintained that power. And I think, at least in my family today, I'm going to say that, yes, that power, particularly starting from great-grandmother Ruth, because her husband died so quickly within their settling in Costa Rica, that she's considered the matriarch of the family and is acknowledged as this pillar of how, this woman who didn't have probably more than a 4th grade education, how she managed to produce in her line, countless doctors, countless engineers, countless professors. There's not one person in my family who is not a professional, not one person, and many of them have multiple careers. So I would say education is something that the women pushed, along with obviously a religious identity.
Definitely. I can definitely relate to a lot of what you said, especially about the dreams. That was definitely something. And then how do, younger generations of Afro Costa Ricans now connect or reclaim their their heritage today?
So how are the younger generation
Like, how are they reclaiming or connecting to their Jamaican heritage?
I would say that there are a couple ways. Like, so in San Jose, there are probably post-COVID, there were a group of Afro-Costa Ricans in San Jose, younger people, who decided to have encuentros, to have Afro encuentros, meaning all Black gatherings, right? So even if you had a partner who was white or mestizo, you had to leave them at home. And basically, this was a space for Black people to get together, just like a barbecue. It wasn't like you weren't networking, it wasn't a conference, but it was basically like multiple generations of people needed to get together. And then what ended up happening was, right after George Floyd, and I would say 2016 with the first 45 election, you started to see a new demographic of Black people from the United States coming to Costa Rica. So historically, Black folks who are expats are retirees, right? They come on a pension. You have to have X amount that you get every month, and they essentially live by the golf courses, and, they are living their best lives, right? And usually their friends are, they're not so many Black couples, so it's usually just a mix of Americans. What happened was, this has radically changed. And so I would say in the last 5 years or 6 years, there have probably been over 5 or 6,000 Black Americans who have moved to Costa Rica as expats who are of young family age, meaning they are either single Black women who are in the wellness business, or have their own sort of counseling online where they have, wealth coming in from virtual sources.
Yes.
Or you have families that are packing up, have children who are school age. They're putting their kids in free public schools that are only Spanish and sort of dropping them in. And these children are growing up multilingual. And parents still obviously maintain a livelihood where they are working online. So Costa Rica has a commitment that they're not going to hire you if you are a non-Costa Rican, unless you can do something that a local cannot, because they're committed to employing Costa Ricans, right? And so really the only thing that you can do, like, to be hired, is to teach English, right? And that is something that, a lot of Americans will come to do, but they'll do it, maybe for a 2-year stint, and then they will kind of go. But if you want to live here, raise your children here, then you have to show, particularly if you want residency, you have to show that you're getting X amount of money every month from an external source. And so all of these folks are generating income from the United States or Canada, but they're living in Costa Rica, right? And so they're bringing their wealth into the country. They're buying homes. There are many, many, many Black expats now, and they live in various places. So I would say a lot of them live on the Caribbean and side of the country, in Limon or Puerto Viejo. I would say in Puerto Viejo, where they're setting up sort of wellness businesses, retreats, holistic spaces for folks to come, multiple times a year, and they have those spaces. But for the most part, a lot of people run businesses online that they maintain from the States, and even some of them have properties in the States, like homes that they rent out still. But they're raising their children, their school-age children here. And so the encuentros became this space, this bridge for Black expats and Afro-Costa Ricans to meet each other and to form a community. And so there have been about, I don't know, maybe about 6 or 7 of these. They're twice a year, and they're incredible gatherings, right? But then you have other gatherings too. Like, so when Black Panther was showing in Costa Rica, it was basically like we bought out a whole, a whole room. Everybody wore white, and we met beforehand. And, so there are all these other kinds of events that happen as the community continues to grow. So I would say that in terms of reclaiming, I don't know what's happening in Limon, because Limon is, it's mixed, right? So you have Afro Costa Ricans, but you have a lot of mestizos. But I think that for the most part, there's an absolute pride of Blackness and Afro Caribbean-ness in Limon. There's no question about that. People have a lot of pride in being Black Costa Ricans.
Amazing. And then, for yourself, what reactions have you received, from Afro Costa Ricans communities regarding your work? Because you have published a lot in regards to this.
Oh, it's been beautiful. It's been really beautiful. I have been well received. I've been invited to conferences with very established Afro-Costa Rican poets and other writers. I am very much included in sort of the pantheon of Afro-Costa Rican writers, even though I'm writing in English. I'm very well respected here. People, welcome me, and I feel very much like, and I have a deep respect for, Shirley Campbell and Kins Duncan. And I mean, there's so many other folks who are doing the work, right? And it's hard because it's not like a massive community, and we have to think about legacy, but very much I was very, very well welcomed into the Afro community of writers and artists here.
Oh, wonderful. And then, as we come to a close, what type of message would you like to leave the listeners or the viewers about Afro Costa Rica?
Yeah, I guess my message is we're here.
Yes.
We're here, right? And that is, I think that's a massive proclamation because in so many ways, people will say, Costa Rica? Oh, Puerto Rico? Oh, I mean, for a long time, folks didn't understand where I was, that I was in Central America or that I didn't live near a beach. I mean, the closest beach to me is 90 minutes and that's a trek. I live in the city, I work, I mean, just do the day-to-day things. So it's not as if I'm under, drinking margaritas under
Yes.
palm trees every day. That's not what's happening, right? I try to get to Puerto Limon at least once a year if
Okay.
I can. But the rigors of life,
Of course.
I mean, doesn't necessarily always allow that. So I would say if there's anything in my story that resonates, it's the idea that we are part of the bigger Black Atlantic. Like I really want um, that to be understood, that there are Black people in Costa Rica, that they are multiple legacies of Black people, right? That the Black people got here essentially with Columbus, right? And that there were enslaved Black people, there were people who were free, right?
Yes.
And had to navigate what that life was like during the colonial period. But Black people were here and created legacy. They built cities, they built buildings, they created roads and created economy. And that's really important. And so there are Black people today in Costa Rica who are from that particular legacy, that colonial legacy, but also from the I guess the newer legacy of the bananas and the railroads, which parallels a lot with what was happening in Panama, obviously with the canal. But it's really important that folks understand that not only did Black people show up here and establish a life and were rounded and created families, multiple generations, but they contributed greatly and continue to contribute greatly to the country. And I would say that Epsie Campbell, who was the first Afro-Costa Rican vice president, is probably a really wonderful shining star of that ability to represent. And it was a huge deal that this Black woman was the first vice president of Costa Rica. And she's done amazing work ever since. Her commitment to anti-racism and to women's work is just unparalleled, And so I wanted to just let people know that we are part of a conversation, right? We are part of the bigger conversations that happen in terms of migration stories in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in the Black Atlantic, right? And that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a stopping point, because my mother and father left in the late 60s to New York, and I was born there. And I have come back to Costa Rica, right? So it's a different level of migration. I've brought my family here. My kids were young. They are completely bilingual. They understand themselves as Afro-Costa Ricans.
Yes. It's basically come full circle for you. So which is wonderful. And again, thank you so much, Natasha, for coming on to the podcast and to be able to speak on this. Again, these are narratives, these are stories that are not always told. And it's not until it becomes a personal story, then people begin to kind of start to understand. But no, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.